Grant, and thank you everyone once again, and welcome to the 2022 Small Farms Winter Webinar Series hosted by the University of Illinois Extension's Local Food Systems and Small Farms team. My name is Zach Grant. I'm a local food systems small farm educator in Cook County, and I'm moderating today's session. I also was formerly the coordinator for the web series that Grant has taken over kindly enough for me. He's been doing a great job. We really appreciate you joining us for these webinars, and we're going to do our best to begin and end within this space of the lunch hour. As you can understand, with the previous sessions, it's really difficult to get all this jam-packed, in-depth information within the hour. So let's get our questions into the chat box during the presentation, and we'll do our best to make sure that we get Bronwyn to answer those questions at the end if we can't answer them in real time. So this week's presentation is from Bronwyn Alec. Bronwyn is our colleague, our local food system small farm educator colleague with U of I Extension, serving Gallatin, Hamilton, Hardin, Pope, Saline, and White counties in the very southernmost part of the state. She has a background in applied research of specialty crops and continues to conduct small fruit and vegetable research in high tunnels at the Dixon Springs Ag Center. Bronwyn also provides educational programs for farmers, community members, decision makers, and others involved in local food systems. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Bronwyn.
Okay, I'm gonna, I guess, share my video here briefly. Okay, just so everybody can get a look at me this morning. Well, I guess it's actually noon now. So I just wanted to say welcome to everyone, and we'll get started. I think I will actually kick my video back off while I'm presenting. Currently where I am at, there is a freezing rain thunderstorm happening. So I hope I don't lose power here at work. We had some freezing rain and sleet yesterday, and right now there's some interesting thunder and lightning and freezing rain happening. So I love Southern Illinois weather. It's always exciting. You never know what you're going to get each day. So with that, I will turn off my video now just so we can save some bandwidth, and then we'll get started. Okay. And I need to share my screen. Okay. And Zach or Grant, how is that looking?
Looks good.
On that end. Okay. All right. Well, again, thanks everybody for joining us for today's webinar. And I'm going to give some information and an update on a research project that I conducted in our high tunnels here at Dixon Springs, looking at some different winter greens. Find my mouse. Across 3 different monitors, and sometimes I'm technologically challenged. There we go. Did the slide advance now for everyone?
Yes, it did.
Okay, sorry about that. I think we're ready to go now. So just as a reminder, when Zach introduced me and said that I was located in far southern Illinois, he wasn't kidding. I work at the very far southern tip here in Illinois, and my office is located at the Dixon Springs Ag Center. We're in the heart of the Shawnee National Forest and just a mere 250 miles south of the main campus in Champaign. And if we think about Illinois and you know, the length of the state being, you know, about 350 miles or so, we do cover 3 different hardiness zone ranges within Illinois. I'm down on the line between the 7A, 6B hardiness zone, and then up in the far northeast corner, folks up there would be in 7A. And so as we listen to this presentation, wherever you're maybe located at within Illinois, please keep in mind your hardiness zones and some of the timelines or dates that I may be talking about as far as planting dates and harvest dates are going to vary, but you know, depending on your location within the state. And so just so that everyone is clear, the research that we did with the high tunnels and the winter greens was conducted in far southern Illinois. Just kind of keep that in mind as we move through the presentation today. So This project was a 2-year project, and it was funded through the Illinois Department of Ag Specialty Crop Block Grant. We were awarded a grant from 2019 to 2021, and the title of this grant proposal was utilizing high tunnels to maximize winter vegetable production. So 2 of our main goals or objectives for this particular project was to try to determine some optimum plant production system parameters for crops like carrots, lettuce, spinach, and kale. And another goal of this would be ultimately, as we look at these parameters and can share some of this information, we hope to be able to increase income and market opportunities for growers that may want to try to capitalize on growing winter vegetables in a high tunnel situation. We hope to be able to also improve access to folks of more local products for a greater part of the year. And so if we can increase winter production using high tunnel systems, we can increase access for folks. And we also wanted to be able to introduce a crop rotation into the high tunnel production system. A lot of growers are utilizing high tunnels for crops like tomatoes and peppers and maybe cucumbers, and those crops tend to have the highest economic return for us in our tunnels. But we do need to think about crop rotation as we see situations where we might have a buildup in disease pressure and other situations that a crop rotation could help benefit production of other crops during the rest of the year. And so the parameters of the treatments that we were looking at in this project were planting date. We also wanted to compare the production of these crops grown on bare ground versus black plastic mulch. We also looked at applying a row cover versus having no row cover on some of these plants. And when I talk about through this presentation whether they were covered or not covered, row cover was only applied during times when the forecasted temperature was going to be 25 degrees or less. So row covers were not left on certain plots through the whole season or time period of this research project. They were taken on and pulled back off depending on the forecasted temperature for each day. And so our plot sizes were about 22 inches wide, which is the width of these raised beds, and then they were about 4 feet long. And so I do understand that everybody's high tunnel situation is going to look a little bit different. For the tunnels at Dixon Springs, we have permanent raised beds that are built into these tunnels, which you can see in this photo. We're using treated 1x6 deck boards to make those beds, and then we are actually able to put in 8 raised beds in a high tunnel that is 35 by 96, and so the spacing is pretty tight in there, but we are trying to maximize the most amount of square foot in production that we could gain from this. And so we also note that the soil level is close to being level with the top of those boards in the raised beds, but can be a little bit lower than that. So this just happens to be how our high tunnel is set up. I know there are a lot of folks that are growing in a high tunnel just on the bare ground on the native soil underneath the tunnel. They may be forming some ridges or hills or raised beds within that, or they may be growing on flat ground. So every person's system is a little bit different. So in the first year of this project, we looked at carrots, kale, spinach, and head lettuce, both a red head lettuce and a green head lettuce. And then these are the varieties that we had selected at this for year 1. On the carrots, it was a Bolero. Kale was winter boar, spinach was Tasman, and then the lettuce was a green butter and then a red oak leaf. And you can see the spacings that we tried to get with those, and our planting method. So other than the carrots, which we direct seeded into the plots, the spinach, kale, and lettuce, we grew out transplants first and then transplanted those into the plots. And the main reason that we did that was because we needed to be able to plant into the black plastic. And so direct seeding wasn't quite optimal for that situation. So we grew transplants out for those 3 crops. And after some of the observations that we made in year 1, I did change varieties on the kale and the carrots and the spinach. For the carrots, the variety Bolero in year 1 was a cold storage type carrot, and honestly, the flavor was really not good at all. And so I wanted to switch that variety up. So we switched to Napoli, and this is a Nantes type. Flavor was a lot better. And if we're thinking about growing these the carrots out for a winter market, we want them to be a really good eating quality. And so I think it was I'm glad I switched up the variety. We need to be looking at varieties that are going to be acceptable to our customers. And so this was a change that we made in year 2. And again, with the kale, we switched from the winter boar to the white Russian variety. I think the winter boar tended to bolt really early. Well, it bolted in the March, April timeline, or end of March, 1st of April for us in year 1. And so we switched to this white Russian that was less likely to bolt. And then for the spinach, we switched from Tasman to the Auroch. The Tasman was a semi-savoid, so a little bit crinkly, and we felt like we wanted a spinach that had a smoother leaf. And so that's why we switched to this. And we also increased our spacing to a 6x6 on the spinach from the 4x6 from the previous year. But again, these were the kale, spinach, and lettuce were transplanted, and the carrots were direct seeded. And so this chart kind of lays out give you an idea of the parameters of the treatments, and then also the planting dates. And so we were comparing no plastic, which would be the same as bare ground, and no row cover, to black plastic with no row cover, bare ground with row cover, plastic with row cover. And when you look at the carrots, we did not put carrots on the plastic. So those were just bare ground comparing, grown in bare ground comparing cover with no cover. And if we look at the planting dates, in year 1, we were planting the carrots. We had 7 planting dates, basically the first week of each month, starting in August. We went all the way through, and our last planting that first year was the first week of February. And as we went into year 2, we modified those planting dates. We still had 7 plant dates, but we increased in September and October. We went 2 additional plant dates, so we were planting 2 weeks apart during those 2 months, but still gave us the 7 plant dates. And as we think about our putting winter greens in and utilizing our high tunnel for hopefully capturing a winter market with those, we also need to be cognizant of the fact that we are probably still going to be using that high tunnel for growing maybe tomatoes or peppers. And we want to utilize the season extension component of the high tunnel for those higher dollar, higher valued crops. And so for us in Illinois, in Southern Illinois, we're typically planting our tomato transplants around the 1st of April in our tunnels. And so if one of the things that we realized in the year 1 of the carrots, I was still harvesting carrots in June. And if I had a large area of my tunnel was devoted to carrots, I wouldn't be able to get my tomatoes out in time. And so that was another reason why we wanted to back those dates up on the carrots, and having more planting dates in the fall as opposed to stretching it out through January and February. So on this slide, I was looking at some different websites that would help with day length calculating. And maybe Zach or Grant could also share this link that I've got in the bottom in the chat, or we can share it at the end of the presentation later. There are a lot of different websites that will work as a day length calculator. This was just one that I felt was relatively easy to use. But we, keep in mind our crops tend to slow down their growth or their production when we hit 10 hours of daylight or less. And as we think about trying to determine planting dates and scheduling our plantings for our succession plantings in our winter crops, having some type of day length calculator can really help that. And so with this particular one, which is solotopo.com, you can type in your address, or on the map, you can actually zoom into your location. So you can see I had put in our location here at Dixon Springs. And, I randomly had done this on January the 5th. And if you look at that, on January the 5th, at our location, we would have about 9 hours and 37 minutes of day length. And it gives us our sunrise was at 7:15 and sunset was at about 4:50 that day. And if we look at today, so it's been about, a little over a month and a half, and we've increased our day length about an hour and 40 minutes. So now sunrise is at 6:30 and our sunset this evening is going to be at about 5:45. So, this kind of gives you, this is a pretty good tool to utilize to help you calculate that day length. And so in general, for us, we know in our location that we're going to start having less than 10 hours of daylight to work with from the middle of January to about from the middle of November to about the third week of January. So now kind of as we've talked about the day length, now let's look at our days to harvest by planting date in year one. And so in this chart, we see we have the 3 planting dates from year one. So the first week of September, first week of October, the first week of November. And then we have the different colored bars represent the different crops, and a couple of the crops also one of the treatments or the parameters that we were looking at. So as we take kale, for example, in September, we see no difference in between kale with or without cover in September or October. But what we did notice in November was that kale that was covered, we were able to harvest 9 days earlier than the kale plots with no cover. And I believe that I can attribute that to the kale was planted on November the 5th. And the first time that our temperatures were low enough to require covering was November the 8th. So we had very small young transplants in the ground, and those that got covered were not set back. The ones that were left uncovered and experienced that lower temperature had a little bit of a setback, and I think we see that in our harvest, days to harvest on the kale. And as we look at spinach, we just, pretty similar days to harvest in September, October, but we're starting to lengthen that out as we get into November's planting. And so that's kind of seeing a trend as our daylight is starting to decrease, the length of time it's taking for our plants to reach that first harvest is increasing. And then lastly, if we look at lettuce in September, pretty similar, 26, 29 days to first harvest. We see a difference in October where I think maybe the temperatures were starting to cool down just a little bit. So lettuce on plastic, we were able to harvest a little bit earlier. But by November, I think any of the heat that the plastic had been holding in the ground had pretty much equaled out to the bare ground temperature. And so we see harvest dates being pretty similar from the November planting date as well. Then as we look at days to harvest in year 2, again, based on our planting date. So we have the first week of September, first week of October, and first week of November. And again, you see the different colored bars representing the different crops. We'll start with kale again, a very similar time period. I think the other one was 26 days. This is 24 days. No difference in the treatments. In September, we see a little bit of a difference in October. So maybe that plastic and cover was a little bit warmer than what the kale liked. And so the bare ground with no cover. Actually, there was in year 2, we actually had not covered yet when this was being harvested. Our first cover date was the end of November. So I think we can just think about the plastic maybe being a little bit warmer than the bare ground, and the kale liking the little bit cooler soil of the bare ground. So we harvested a little bit earlier. And then where we see a big jump is the November planted, the kale with plastic in the cover. We were able to harvest a lot sooner than kale that was on bare ground and no cover. And I think this is a pretty significant difference in days to harvest, but I think a lot of this can be attributed to the weather, the different weather patterns that we saw from year 1 to year 2. If we look at spinach, pretty similar, no difference in September. In October, with the no plastic, we actually harvested 12 days earlier than spinach on plastic. And again, I think the spinach likes the cooler temperature, and so the bare ground soil temperature was a little bit cooler than the rows with the plastic, and so we saw earlier harvesting on that planting date. And then again in November, things kind of equal back out. And then lastly, we'll look at the lettuce, similar and same in September, same in October, and then we see actually a missing bar for the November planted lettuce. And we'll talk about a little bit some of our pest issues, but this is a good example of why we do research for multiple seasons, because there can be situations that arise that we don't account for. And in our case, we had a pretty significant vole problem, and they took out, the voles really liked one row of plastic, and so they took out a lot of our plots in that area and really decimated the lettuce in the black plastic row. Also in year 2, we had a very pretty significant cold snap in February, and the plots that were not covered, the lettuce plots that were not covered, suffered very severe cold damage and were not harvestable. So, I can account for why we have no days to harvest on that lettuce, because there really wasn't anything to harvest. So in this chart, we're just kind of comparing the harvest dates for each of the transplant dates for each year of the crop. And so we saw that change in variety in each of these, well, in the spinach and the kale. And I think we see that change in variety. We had an increase in the number of harvests for the spinach and the kale, but pretty similar between years on when the first harvest date was for each of the plant dates. Where we see the increase in the number of harvests can be on the tail end. As we look at the spinach variety, actually pretty similar as far as when the first and the last harvest dates. But as we look at kale, most of the kale was ending. I think we had one large harvest in the end of March in that first year. But for the most part, the kales were finishing up mid to late January. Whereas in year two with the white Russian variety of kale, we were able to have a better harvest time frame in through January, February, and into March. So I just kind of wanted to show those. And so now we will look at a couple of charts, a few charts here to kind of show the harvest trends a little bit. So if we look at year one with the kale and the winter boar, and so with the blue bars would be the kale that was planted in September. So first week of September plant date. You see we're starting to harvest around the first week of October, and as we move through October into the first week of November, our yields are increasing. So those plants are growing pretty strong. And the longer they're in the ground, we see an increase in production. And then we see a drop off and we don't see any more harvests until about the first week of January, and we see a very large harvest there. And so, I think as we are approaching our 10 or our day length, our 10-hour per day length, as we're starting to see that approach the 10 hours or less, our harvest, our plants were slowing down. And so we had this long span between middle of November and January to build up enough in those plots to be worth harvesting. We see a pretty similar trend for the October planted kale. Again, we're building, we're harvesting through mid to late November into the first of December. And then we see a lull in basically from the middle of January through the end of February, and then we see it pick back up with some more production again mid-March or so. And then the November planted kale, we had a little bit of harvest the 1st of January, but then we see our main harvests were in through February and March. And then this chart just kind of, I think, is a really good visual of how our production is our harvest window is pretty high the first part of October. And then as we're approaching those 10-hour of day length days, our production starts to fall off and we're kind of in a lull. And then as the day length starts to increase, we start to see our production pick back up. And the end of February, 1st of March, then our production is pretty elevated again. And each of these colored lines represent the different treatments or parameters. And we see that there's really no difference for spinach anyway, in these treatment parameters. That harvest trend is there across all of them. There's no major spike or peak for any one particular treatment or parameter. And we see a very similar trend here for year 2 of spinach as well. We see that, remember for our location, that mid-November to the 3rd week of January is our shortest day length period of the year. And so we see a higher harvest early, and then we see those peaks again kicking in February and March. And if we think about, again, remembering why we do research multiple years as we think about the number of days that our plots needed to be covered versus or covered or not. In year one, there were a total of 12 days from the time the plots were planted until they were until the project was completed for the season, that those designated plots that were to receive row cover actually needed to be covered. And so our first covered day in year one was November the 8th. And we look at year two, the first date that we needed to cover was actually the end of November, so November 30th. But in year two, we had our plots were covered almost over twice as many days for that whole production season as compared to year one. And if you also look at the last date that we needed to cover in year one, after there was no need to cover anymore after the middle of February. And in year two, we had another frost event come through March 31st, April 1st. So we had to cover as late as April 1st. And in year two, which would have been last year, we had 12 days in the month of February that the plots stayed covered. Around just right after Valentine's Day at our location, we received quite a bit of cold snow and ice, and temperature stayed below freezing for almost 2 weeks. So this gives a comparison of how seasons can change from year to year, or production changes from year to year based on our weather patterns. And I think we saw some differences in first harvest between plots that were able to be covered or uncovered, or potential overall. And there were a couple of plots, as I think about the second year of lettuce in that November planting, that really benefited from being covered. When I looked at these plots in year one, and this picture is a good demonstration of it. This was taken November 14th, right after a cover had been removed, and just before we were going to begin first harvest on this particular plot of kale that would have been planted. This would have been October planted kale. Visually, it looks like a really significant, or a large difference between the plots. You see the green stake in the middle with the white strings. We used these strings to hold up the cover, but to the left of that green stake would have been the plot that was covered, and to the right it would have been uncovered. So it's pretty easy to see there was a difference in what the plants looked like, or the benefit that the cover was giving them. But when we ran the numbers for overall, looking at the yield, we did not see a statistical difference in those. And again, just wanted to show the carrots. Again, the carrots were all direct seeded on bare ground, and the only parameter differences or treatment differences was covered versus uncovered. And again, this shows a demo of the carrots. You can see the cover on it just on the top of the picture there had been pulled back, and so that plot had been covered versus the carrots in the foreground that had been left uncovered. You can see how the foliage is hanging down and unhappy. In the first year, the only significant difference that we saw in planting dates on carrots where row cover made a difference was in the January and February planted carrots. And again, I think that those tiny plants, once they finally germinated, having some of the cover on them, helped with their growth early on. So now I want to talk just briefly about some of the pests. Just because it's winter, those pests are still pretty pesky and can be bothersome. We had in particular problems with voles, and a rabbit was a pretty good friend of ours. We were this picture cracks me up. He thought he was hiding in the carrots, but I found him anyway and snapped his photo of him. I don't know that Mr. Rabbit here actually ate any of our carrots. I was expecting like a whole Bugs Bunny cartoon situation where you just see a carrot, disappear, but I think he was mainly just hiding in them. But obviously the other two pictures, very classic vole damage. They were tunneling within our raised beds and would literally in an evening just wipe out, multiple heads of lettuce or take out the spinach. And whether it was on the plastic or the bare ground, they were in both plot areas, but they seem to be they caused quite a bit of damage in the row that we had black plastic on. That plastic just made a great hideout for them, and they could just run all along the length of the row and pull the plants out through, down through the hole in the plastic and be nibbling on those. So, we did try to utilize multiple pest management techniques with those, and hopefully we've got them under control for when we go back again with more winter projects. And honestly, we had just a few minor insect pests, but there was really nothing that stood out that was too problematic. We had a few aphids here and there, maybe a little bit of cabbage worm that came in, but it was pretty easy to take care of. So we talk about we go through some conclusions that we came up with on the kale. So we saw no significant yield differences between treatment effects. So whether it was grown on bare ground, black plastic, with or without row cover, there really was no overall significant yield difference. Some of the couple of things that did stand out in year one, the November planted covered plots were harvested 9 days earlier. And again, I think I talked about that. The timing of when that cover first had to go on, which was about November the 8th, the transplants had only been in the ground about 3 days. And so those plots that were covered definitely benefited from that protection that the row cover afforded. And we saw that increase. We saw that play out as far as those plots being able to be harvested earlier in the season than the other plots. Also, the November planting date yields were significantly higher in year two. And I think that can be accounted for both the variety and also just a large part of the yields from the harvest from that November planting occurred in February and March. We had really significant yields from that plot in those. And when I say significant, I mean a large volume was able to be harvested in February and March from that November planting. And then October planting date yields were significantly less in both years. That's across any of the treatments. Just in general, the October planting date tended to yield less. And I think what maybe what's happening there is those plants set out in October, there's enough day length still available that they are starting to grow and starting to produce. They just kind of get started, and then the daylight's tapering off enough that then they're shutting back down. And so they have spent a little bit of energy producing a little bit in the fall, and then as they kick back into production, in early February, they don't have quite as much energy going into February as, say, the November planting does. And then also September planting, we see the majority of that harvest is happening, before Christmas. And so, they have spent the majority of their energy before those day length, before the day length starts to decrease too much. So I think that's kind of where one of the reasons why I think we saw that trend for the kale for the October planting dates. And then for spinach, again, no significant yield differences between the treatment effects. And in year one, the November planting date, again, yielded significantly higher than the October plant date. And I think kind of some of those same reasons that I mentioned for kale. When we look at lettuce, we did see one significant difference in year two. When we ran our statistical analysis on our yields, the treatment that we saw was on the November planted bare ground with cover. And I think, again, this goes back to our in year two, we had increased number of days that row covers were needed or required. And when we compare the November on bare ground with and without the row cover definitely provided a benefit. And so that we see that with this lettuce. And then other than that particular incident in year two on that November planting date with the cover versus the no cover, we didn't see there were no other significant yield differences between treatment effects, at least not in year one. In year one, also the first harvest of the October planted lettuce on the plastic was about 12 days earlier than the bare ground. And in year two, we saw a significant difference in the yield for November planted lettuce with no plastic but covered, higher than the other treatments. That's what we talked about on that first slide, or the previous slide. And then if we think about in year two, if we don't, without treatment effects, but just looking at the plant date, we did see a significant difference between each of the planting dates, with September being the highest. And I think, again, we can attribute that to our cold February, and also the critters or our pests that were pretty bothersome in that November planting on the lettuce. And as far as carrots, I think from looking at the last, those two seasons, an optimal seeding time frame for carrots would be ranging from the first week of September through the first week of November. And that's for harvest that would begin in mid-November and run through about the 1st of April. And again, we're wanting these harvests to be over the 1st of April, maybe even the 3rd week of March, middle of March, so that we can prep and be ready to go with our next crop, our cash crop for the coming summer. So just some general observations. Black plastic mulch or weed mat, I think it does create a barrier that's going to allow for a cleaner product. It's going to hopefully help with some weed control if that is potentially an issue in your high tunnel. Because we saw no treatment effects, we might not have seen anything that the plastic benefited from us overall, but it also didn't hinder us. So, if weed control is an issue and you want to be able to use black plastic or a weed mat, I think that's, definitely try to utilize it in your system if you can. Just observationally, we did notice that the spinach tended to be a little bit more tender that was grown on the black plastic versus the bare ground, but the kale was just the opposite. Kale on the bare ground tended to be a little bit more tender than that grown on the black plastic. And row cover is going to be especially important on your young, for protecting your young transplants, and then that later planted lettuce. When you think about these crops, the lettuce is going to be the more sensitive to, or the least cold tolerant compared to the spinach and the kale. Last in that second year for us in February, we had those sustained days of being below freezing. The kale and the spinach, they looked pretty droopy, first thing in the morning, but they would pop out of it once those temperatures warmed up. And the lettuce, just didn't rebound quite as well. And I think lastly, thinking about adjusting your planting dates to anywhere between 7 and 14 days apart to maintain a more consistent harvest pattern. With our dates being about a month apart, a couple of those slides that we saw, those trends where we would see a peak and then it would fall off, and then we'd see the peak from the next planting that was a month away. I think we could move those peaks closer together by moving our planting dates closer together. And again, that's going to vary on your location and also your day length as you start to calculate for day length. And I think now I need to do a couple of plugs for the Illinois Fruit and Vegetable Newsletter. This is a commercial grower newsletter. We provide regional updates, pest and production information. Nathan Johanning and myself are co-editors for that. We do put out about 12 issues a year. And so if you'd like to receive email notification to receive the newsletter, just send Nathan or I an email, and we'd be happy to add you to the list for that. And also, we do still have an ag needs survey that is going out statewide. And so if you have not had the chance to fill out the survey, we would definitely ask you to take part in that. If you would like to, there's you can go online at the website here, the go.illinois.edu/agneeds, or you can click on the QR code. I think you probably were emailed a PDF of the handouts, so the QR code is in there, so you can just scan it and go. But we would really appreciate as many folks as possible filling out this survey. It helps to give us direction in our future programming and research and allow extension to hopefully better serve the needs of all the farmers in the state of Illinois. So if you've got it may take 10 or 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes to fill that out, but please take time to do that if you haven't done so already. And then with that, I'd just like to thank some of the contributors for this project. Julie Zakes, work with Julie here at Dixon Springs, and she's, none of this work would get completed without Julie. She's, takes care of the date, all of the planting and plot prep and harvesting and everything. So, big thanks to Julie. And Katie Bell, during this time, she was worked as an intern with us here and has now transitioned to an educator position in Jackson County, the Murfreesboro office. So, but Katie helped participate in this project with plot establishment and harvest as well. And also Jennifer Warren works in our unit. And obviously our College of ACES, the Office of Research, Illinois Vegetable Growers Association, the Illinois Department of Ag. We wouldn't have this project if they hadn't funded our grant proposal. And also thanks to Seedway, Johnny's, and Rups for donating seed for this project. And I think with that, I guess we can take some questions.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Bronwyn. And you'll also see that Grant has launched a demographics poll. So you have a great team behind the scenes here helping answer some of these questions between myself, Nathan, Shelby, and Julie. I think we knocked a lot of them out. But we'll get your take on some of these. We'll circle back around to them. But one question that I think that wasn't addressed in the comment box yet was disease issues. Did you encounter any winter disease issues?
Not a whole lot. I think we did see maybe a little bit of powdery mildew, but not a whole lot. Some of the spinach, especially in year one, we noticed towards the end of the season, it was starting to have some yellow tipping on it, and so some of those we felt were, as we were harvesting and grading those, we consider those not marketable. But not a real, I don't think a lot of disease issue, not really.
Okay, so let's circle back around to some of these that we kind of answered a little bit, but maybe we'll get your further elaboration on. So there was a lot of dialogue Nathan and I responded to related to raised beds in the tunnels. Haven't seen a lot of farmers doing it this way. And Nathan and I responded both openly and in private chat. Do you want to elaborate any more about the use of raised beds? I commented that I see it quite a bit in research and demonstration. I mean, even with my urban farmers, I very rarely see structured raised beds. But Nathan mentioned it being more common, at least built structured raised beds, maybe in Southern Illinois. So I don't know if you want to just add anything to that.
Well, and so I think one of the reasons, one of the reasons why we started with the structured raised beds in the tunnels at Dixon Springs was, like I mentioned, to maximize the total amount of growing area that you can capture. And, if we, just like we see benefit in field production on a raised bed, we also see that in a high tunnel situation. And, out in the field, if we're going to make a raised bed, we may have a bed shaper mulch lift or mulch layer machine that's going to make those beds for us. Well, it's really hard to get that equipment, that same equipment in a high tunnel. And so if we were able to get that equipment through, we may only be able to get five beds in the tunnel. But by making these permanent raised beds, we can move from 5 to 8. So that really increases the amount of space that we can use for in production. And that was one of the reasons why we went with those here on site. Is it a little bit tight in there, especially when we're growing tomatoes or something in the summertime when our humidity levels are are extremely high? Yes, it is. And we learn to adapt with different management techniques for that, having HAF fans going, having as much airflow as possible. And so that's one of the reasons that probably one of the biggest reasons why we went with the more permanent raised bed structure in our tunnels.
Yeah, that makes sense. I noticed at our tunnel in Cook, we have kind of mounded raised beds. And I'd been used to using movable tunnels at the student farm. And one thing I didn't account for with my spring tomato production and being on that drip irrigation schedule is how wet the beds were. So when I went to flip it around to do winter production, my beds were so wet, it was hard to prep. But I would imagine if you had these built structured raised beds, that wouldn't be as big of a problem. So,
yeah. And with this, while it can be, can be time consuming, like can be, costly depending on what your sources are. We have the ability to basically shovel the soil out of those raised beds and put something new in. And so we can amend with compost and different things in that. And also our particular site, our soil was not great. It's a very heavy clay. And so, our native soil was not going to be the best in that site location to be growing in. So this allows us to make soil amendments as needed. There can be, I'm sure there are lots of folks that have, tunnels set up on, really great high organic matter native soils that there's no sense in going in creating those permanent raised beds when you've got the great, native natural source right there.
Yeah, that makes sense. It might be fun to do a cost benefit analysis with that, because you often see raised beds and high tunnels used, but yeah, maybe the combination of the two would be interesting to do. Okay, thanks for those comments, Bronwyn. Let's move through some of these that were answered just really quickly. Someone asked about samples with row cover but no plastic ground mulch in year 2 for kale, and I think Nathan answered yes. So maybe there was a question if that was one of the treatments, and I think it was. Then the planting dates are when the transplants went into the ground, correct? And Julie answered that in terms of that. It's not the transplant seeding date. That was actually when the plants went into the ground.
Correct. Yep.
Lots of conversation about vole control, and Nathan, Shelby, and we were all kind of throwing out different options in there. I noticed, so we actually in year 1 of our new tunnel, we had kind of a gravel moat around the perimeter of it with flashing at the bottom of it. And we didn't complete one side of it before the winter, had massive vole problems. We're trapping them like crazy. This year we completed the perimeter with the moat and the flashing, have not trapped one vole yet. So I think enclosure is possibility, but that might be a consideration when
Yeah.
building the tunnel, and maybe more expensive after you already built it, but maybe an option. I don't know if you had any other vole control options.
No, I think you're right. If you can get, your gravel and the gravel moat area and that flashing, if you can try to exclude them. On our tunnel, we have gravel on the two sides and the south end wall, but the north end wall we don't really have gravel there, and it's just sod right up to the back of the tunnel. And so I think that was probably their access point. We see that, as we think about voles out in the field, when we have a low mowed area, we can see those runs. And then if we have an area that's clean cultivated where we've tilled up the ground, they don't tend to run out into those. They need something with a little bit of cover. And so, I think that's where your gravel moat and your flashing come into play. That's kind of the same as having a tilled worked ground, that they're exposed and they don't go into those areas.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so Julie answered the question about the transplant size, 200 cell trays. Here was one question I think Julie partially answered, but maybe you can elaborate on more. It's kind of long. So did you experience any losses from cold in young or mature plants? Do you have interior tunnel temperature data? They're commenting that they're on the edge of 5A. Can you speculate major differences? We could expect. We haven't done tunnels because we assume they would need heating for year-round planting.
So as far as air temperature numbers, we did have data loggers in where we were looking at soil temperatures on the bare ground versus underneath the plastic, and then also air temperature. And so I just, those data loggers were going constantly for basically, 2 years. And so pulling those, I went back right before this presentation and was looking at that. And I took the coldest day that we had in February of that year 2, when we had that sustained cold period, below freezing temperatures. And so the bare ground temperature, and again, so this is around February 16th to 17th. Okay. Bare ground temperature was between 26 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the temperature under plastic was at 33 degrees. And I saw nowhere where under the plastic, the soil temperature was below freezing. The lowest temperature I saw was that 33. So it is giving us a few degrees, in our situation, we got a few degrees warmer difference than that of the bare ground. And then as far as the air temperature, the lowest air temperature that we recorded was about 7 degrees. And that is not under a row cover. That's just the air temperature at crop level in the tunnel. And I think probably that would have coordinated with probably the coldest day that we had in February.
Yeah, we noticed the same. I mean, we have massive differences between nighttime ambient outside air temperature and under those second layers, like as much as like 20, 30 degrees difference on the coldest night of the year. So, and we're in 5B. So in terms of speculation about whether the winter system works unheated, it absolutely does work. Maybe not with all the crops. Spinach, kale do well, carrots do well, but something similar to lettuce like you in Southern Illinois.
Yeah, no, I think that those crops, I mean, especially the kale and the spinach, I don't think any of our temperatures hurt them at all. If we're not under cover. And I think if you're, in that 5 area, if you're worried about it, I think, obviously the row cover is going to give you some added protection and benefit. And I think the weight of the row cover that we were using was, I believe it was the 1.5 ounces. I think we have a roll of heavyweight row cover. And if it's not 1.5 ounces, it's 1.25 ounces. So.
Excellent. So I just want to pause for 1 second. We have a few more questions we can answer, but I just want to acknowledge that we're getting to the end of the lunch hour. So I want to thank Bronwyn really quick for her great presentation and hope that you got something out of this if you have to leave. The webinar is being recorded, and there is a shortened URL that we can put in the chat box where you can find this once it's uploaded. And next week, we're going to be talking about vermicomposting, so definitely come back for that next week. But I just wanted to acknowledge that really quick because we are at the 1 p.m. hour. A few more questions, if Bronwyn, if you can stick around, and for those of you who haven't had your questions answered, maybe we can knock out these last few questions.
Sure.
Okay, awesome. So there was a question about irrigating crops under the plastic row covers, and Julie and Nathan answered that it was drip, and I think a 4-inch emitter spacing.
Yes.
What
yep.
was
and a double row. We had double row 4-inch emitter spacing. So
excellent. Shelby actually commented that your crops look perfect. Do you measure consumer response to them? They've been having difficulty getting anyone to eat leafy crops like Swiss chard and kale.
Yeah, I mean, well, you know, Julie will tell you that she doesn't eat anything green, and I'm trying to learn to like kale. But you know, for this project, we did not really go out and you know, try to get consumer input on it. We actually donated quite a bit of this to a couple of our local schools, just to try to, you know, fill in for them if they wanted to throw it out to the kids or the teachers, as far as the lettuce and the spinach, carrots. I do know that carrot variety from year one, it didn't matter what the plant date was, it was not good. So I think as far as carrots, if there are varieties that, you know, your consumers already are known to like, or you know, I think definitely stick with those. But I don't really think that I noticed any overly bitter taste on any of the crops, as far as, you know, sometimes we can see that on as they get too hot, you know. So even late in the spring, I don't know that I noticed too much bitterness on them. I do know that first year of carrot in September, the September planting, that year one for us in September, that was the year that we had almost every day in September, except for maybe 5 days, the temperature was above 95 degrees. It was very, very hot here that whole month of September, and those carrots were horrible.
Mm-hmm.
They did not like that heat. They were really bad. I don't even think Julie's horses didn't even eat them. So.
Okay, so there's a couple other questions here. I think I see that the participants who asked them are still on, so we'll go ahead and knock these out really quick. A couple of them are kind of related, but the first one is related to a cost benefit to hardware cloth underneath the bed as maybe a protection for groundhogs, maybe vole protection. Have you ever considered that, or aware of growers? I know people do it in raised beds all the time, but I wasn't sure if you ever looked at that from a cost benefit analysis.
We have not looked at that, no. And from where it looked like those voles were entering, again, I think from our earlier conversation of being able to exclude them, you know, from, you know, having an area outside of the tunnel where we can kind of keep them away, whether it be gravel or the flashing, I think is going to be a pretty good benefit.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay, so there's two separate questions, somewhat related. Maybe I'll kind of try to ask, maybe it all together in one question. Some of it relates to using non-petrochemical ground covers, so non-plastic based ground covers, as an option for a treatment in the future, like straw ground cover, for instance. And then there was kind of a question related to that about soil biota and maybe levels of soil biota affected by the different mulch levels. So maybe about the organic mulches, was there any consideration for that as a treatment?
You know, it's interesting whenever you do a research project, you always open the door for a lot more projects or a lot more things to look at once you look at one. And really, one of the reasons why we chose the black plastic mulch was, we see the benefit of black plastic mulch in a field setting as far as helping to increase soil temperature. And so we wanted to see if, we could see any treatment effects by using the black plastic mulch to heat that soil within the tunnel, to see if we could change our harvest dates, see if there would be an impact on how quickly we could increase or delay harvest from the same plant date. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so that's the black plastic mulch is a material that we're used to working with, and it was relatively easy for us to attach onto our raised bed. Now that we have seen this, the data that, we really didn't see a significant difference in the yields, I think we could potentially look at some other mulching materials and look at that as well. We did like the fact that the crops were, especially the spinach, harvested off of the black plastic was a lot cleaner.
Not to mention those organic mulches typically tend to have more of a cooling effect on the soil, if I'm not mistaken, versus the warming that you're trying to get with that treatment. So that might be. Right. Any comments about sort of soil bacteria biota levels? I know there is some concern about soil heating, solarization, use of plastics, and sort of
I don't think we ever got that hot to have any issues with that.
Right. And typically I've seen some papers with even plastic solarization that suggest that some of the soil biota bounce back relatively quickly after it's over. I know that, that may not, I think it's a really dynamic system. It's hard to really find a strong correlation there, but it's a good question, worthwhile question. Okay. So I think that covers that. There may have been one more comment about natural repellents for voles, suggestions. And then maybe Nathan's kind of jumping in there a little bit. I'm not aware of any. I think the trapping or exclusion seems to be the best strategy in some of those cultural controls that Nathan mentioned.
Yeah, I think we were maybe even sprinkling some red pepper flakes out there, trying to deter them a little bit. But I really think, ultimately exclusion is going to be more of a long-term thing to think about as far as managing those, the voles and stuff.
Excellent. Okay, so one last question, and we'll wrap it up here because we're getting about 10 after. Don't want to take too much of everyone's time. Someone asked this question about crop quality and throwing in something like sugar analysis with bricks in terms of maybe flavor quality differences or nutrient uptake. Was that a consideration at all in terms of one of your dependent variables that you were looking at? Or I know there is some interest in that, like petiole sap analysis and bricks. We're doing a little bit of that, but nothing replicated.
For this particular project, no, we were not looking at that. And like I said, this, you do one and then it spurs a lot of other ideas of things that you would like to look at. And you just, there's only so much time that you have for things to look at. So for this particular project, no, we did not look at those things. But yeah, I think it's definitely, worth looking at for sure.
Well, one thing I will note, you mentioned your switch from what was the spinach to Auroch. We've been trying Auroch this year, and I just love the quality of Auroch. Not to mention that sort of upright growth that's much more easier for hand harvesting. It's just totally different than the other varieties. So I think I want to move towards using Auroch probably exclusively.
Yeah, I think that Julie, Jennifer, and Katie, they did. Let's just say they did 100% of the harvesting. And I think Julie was much happier in year 2 with that variety as far as the ease of harvest. We did like that was a good change in variety. We did like that a lot, and I thought the flavor was great on it. So
Great. All right. Well, I want to thank Bronwyn once again, and thanks everyone for joining us for the winter webinar series. If you haven't had a chance to fill out that demographic poll, feel free to do so. Grant put the link for the recorded webinar in the chat box, and we will see everyone next week for vermicomposting. Have a great week, and hopefully if you're up north, we don't get too much snow today. So take care, everyone.
yep. Thanks, everybody.